Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hey everybody, how you doing? Let me get a comment up in here. I'm gonna pin that for you guys, and then this way we can begin. Paste. There we go. I'm gonna send that, and sorry about that. Hold on. There we go. Sorry about that. Let me just pin this comment. And then, there we go, it's done. Alright, how's everybody doing tonight? So, tonight is On the Path, and we have, a really good topic tonight, and that is Divination by the Genii. And many of you have probably heard of the Genii and automatically think about what the Genii are. Most of you have heard the Genii from, or Genetian magic or whatnot. Most of you have heard of it from the science fiction television series Stargate Atlantis. The Genii were people who lived above ground and underground, right? And so, but they were, they were, I guess to a point, they sort of they weren't malicious, though. They could have the ability to manipulate others, and so because of that, I guess they were named Genii, and you guys all know what the Genii are. The Genii is the plural form of the word genie, right? Genie. And there are many stories of genies, from the very northeastern stories, even not northeastern stories, I should say, the Middle Eastern stories of the genie in the bottle, and he comes out when you rub it, whatnot. But tonight, we're going to talk about this idea of historical divination with a subset of the Genii, and those are elves. And the reason why we're going to talk about elves tonight is because I thought that, especially the ones we're going to speak about tonight, is because of the fact that the elves we're going to talk about tonight are most appropriate to speak about during winter. And even though winter is almost over and we're moving into a Mulg soon, and the winter vernal equinox, I would say that it's pretty impressive that we should at least get one or two more talks in regarding at least some lessons that should be learned. And to clarify also that there are many different there are many different things that go around saying that the Druids worked with elves, and I'll be honest with you, moving from I would say Ross to Chadwick, to Ellis, and I would even say Steiner. When you read these, I guess when you read these detailed historical pieces on the Druids, and these are books that are written without magic involved. These are books that are written with just basically all the history of Druids. The magic comes in books like magic books, if you will, books on Druid magic and things like that. But you don't really hear a lot of the types of magic that were done simply with the Druids. And there is good reason for that, because there's no, well, there could be, according to Thomas Sheridan, there could be some books, but there are very few books right now that we have, if any, that we could read, with the exception of, say, folklore and myth and whatnot, and other types of lore and folk tales, we really don't have much left as far as the dogma of magic that would be something called Dreo. You have a lot of influences of the especially that come out in the mid 1900s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, and that whole peace loving movement, but those types of things, and I don't want to knock them, but at the same time, because I do respect, I do respect some of that work, but the thing is that the types of magic that they did in that time usually came with recreational things, like recreational drugs and whatnot, that people use to kind of get them to enhance their visions and things of that nature. Particularly, I don't care whether or not you use whatever, as long as I guess you know what you're doing, and you know that you're being honest with your physician. But the thing about it is that I particularly don't use any sort of those sort of additional things when I go ahead and do vision work, especially, or divination. I am absolutely using nothing. I'm on my own accord, and I am in control of my own faculties. So I think that we really need to be cautious of that. So we have a lot for you tonight, and I hope you invite your friends to see this. If you can, share this video if you can. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'll put a link below to the YouTube channel, and please subscribe to that. Make sure, if you can. I mean, I was hoping to get 1,000 by Christmas, but then I wasn't doing many videos and whatnot, so I figured, you know what, let me start back up again, and I got to get my lazy butt and start getting back to the books. For a while, whatnot, with coming down with a cold and whatnot. It was and then everybody getting colds. It was kind of hard for me to really manage and get through any work that I really needed to get through. So thank you for joining. I come to you as Druid Nicholas de Clan, founder of the Druid Circle, founder of Druid Order of Blessed Stone and Wood, founder of Druid University, founder of Druid Living, a conservative folk media outlet. So let's begin. So I wanted to start by actually talking about what we're going to be doing tonight, and that is, number one, we're going to talk about the possibility of this Druidic participation with elves. All right, that's number one. Number two, retainment of elves through the ages. Number three, a summary of King Gylfi. Why are we using that king in particular? Because the story that I'm going to be talking about is Gylfaginning, and that story is going to help highlight some of the elves that we're actually going to be talking about. And then the four specific elves that I wish to highlight in this presentation tonight. So let's begin. All right, let's begin. The Druidic participation of elves. So I have, like I said, I delved into almost all of my, what do I got? I have about 100 books on just Druidism. Not Druid magic, just pure Druidism, like the historical aspects of the Druids, what we know about the Druids, right? And I also did a lot of personal, I did some personal conversations with the Druids to kind of help me out along the way. And there was really nothing that I found to say that the Druids themselves worked with elves. That is not to say that a druid today, or a contemporary druid, that doesn't necessarily mean that he or she does not practice the old ways. It just means that a druid in this day and age, today, in 2022, we are called contemporaries. That's all we are. We're contemporary. It's the timeline that we are with. We're not modern. We're contemporary. So this that druids today would probably invoke elves, being very careful with what they invoke. So, but I didn't actually find anything in any of my books on the druids that really would really ferment the idea that druids and elves worked together, that there was some sort of a connection there. I don't think that really happened. But I found something that could be. I found something that could be a reason why it would be thought that druids did practice with elves. Okay? And I want to read this to you because I think this is fairly important. Okay? And I'm going to begin by reading this section. Okay? This is from a book entitled Magic, and it's a first edition. It's by Paul Christian. That's right. So it's on page 354. Okay, Divination by the Genii, and we talked about that earlier. Divination by the Genii, okay, or demonoscopy, was used to evoke supernatural beings who are inferior to the gods, but whose pagan presence peopled air, fire, earth, and water. Belief in them still persists among all the northern races. Remember, there aren't 4 races. There are many, 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 many different races. Official Christianity made repeated and vain efforts, especially in wooded, mountainous regions, to uproot these poetic superstitions. Okay? So that gives us a little sense of understanding that elves, okay, are related to the elements. All right. Many would say that fairies, different from elves, would be, say, representative of a different element of earth, air, water, or fire. But one of the things I found interesting was that it says right here, and this is really interesting here. We know that the Druidical cult, prescribed in Gaul by Roman policy, took refuge in Great Britain, which was still unconquered, and that its original survivals were for a long time afterwards found among the descendants of the Cymric race. The fairy beings of both countries had so much in common that for a long while they were considered to be the souls of the ancient Druids, who, not having died in a state of sufficient purity to enable them to rise at once to an abode of perpetual bliss, had to remain between heaven and earth until the day of judgment. Now, this is all post-Christian, this is all Christianized folklore. All right. these mysterious beings exercised a great hold over the imagination of the Middle Ages, and their power was much feared. So here we get the idea and why it's possible that people have misjudged Druids working with elves, whereas it may be possible that, as Paul Christian tries to argue this point, says that these particular elves, okay, were never elves to begin with. That they were Druids who died with impurities and ended up to be elves for an eternity. Okay? For an eternity. That would be the bliss. That would be the Gwynfyd. Now, knowing that, we see this beautiful idea that if the Druid was not able to transmigrate into another soul, okay, or to transmigrate his soul and replace it with another being's soul, that Druid would in fact become an elf. And that, I think, is incredibly interesting, because you really don't hear any of that in much folklore. That's and I went into some books, and I have a few books, at least 12 books on superstition, and I caught it in a few of those. This idea that the Druids, especially the old priests, the priests of the old religion, okay, that they would move into either being fairies or being elves or being something. They were priests, right? And if they died without a pure heart, without a pure soul, without a pure mind, without a pure spirit, that they would then become these elves. So I don't necessarily believe, though, at any point that historically the Druids had invoked elves, especially knowing that they could become them. But I said it might be possible if they knew that they were actually invoking other Druids. So we really don't know. There is no definite, though at the same time, there isn't much literature on the idea that the Druid then used elves. In all types of mediation, the Druids themselves would then invoke the gods, not necessarily the mysticals, okay, not necessarily the fae, not necessarily any of that. The Druids would only invoke the gods and be mediators between God and man, whatever the particular deity is and whatever the particular person is. That mediation would happen by a Druid. That Druid would be the personification of Esus, or Esus, which is the Lord, E-S-U-S. So I don't necessarily agree with the idea that the Druids did invoke elves or used elves in their magic. I think that if anything, they would have used the essence of the elements themselves, not necessarily the guardians of those elements. I'm sure there could have been some kind of a permission quote within their dialogue, within their ritual, that they're like sort of like a prenup, if you will, where they would ask the elves, look, listen, before we go ahead and do this, is this okay? Whatever the case is. So I found that source particularly interesting, and we're going to go ahead and use Christian tonight, Paul Christian in the book Magic. Let me just show it to you one more time. So we're gonna go ahead and use that to talk more about this. Okay, retaining the next. So now I want to move into this idea of retaining elves, and why did elves kind of disappear? Not in full. We still talk about elves with Santa. We still talk about elves with certain holidays. We talk about leprechauns and things of that nature, right? Okay, so but in general, why did, all right, the church, the Catholic Church, necessarily speaking, Vatican II, why did it wipe out elves? Why did it erase them? All right. Well, we don't know, okay, what the reasoning of the church is, but we do know that the elves themselves were in prayers, were in invocations, they were in petitions, and we find that if you go back to some of the old ritual books in the 1800s, you will find a sort of way of invoking some of these creatures. Creatures from the word creation, not necessarily creatures as in just ugly things, right? But there was a point that certain bishops would stick their nihil obstat imprimatur on books that allowed for elves to be in there. The church just, eventually, defrocked those bishops, and we were left without elves. So I think that it's very important that we think about this idea of how possible is it that elves were such an important part of the Norse tribes and Norse folklore, that they could have merged in and within the angelic choir. And I think that that's basically what ended up happening, that these elves would then just become part of the angels, the guardians, or the demons. I think that, that they stayed, but not, that they were not necessarily erased. If they were purely erased, then we would not have elves today at all. There would be no sign of them. There would be nothing on them, right? So what ends up happening is that only if there was this extermination of them, then we would have we wouldn't see them today, we wouldn't know about them today or anything like that, unless we did go back into old texts. Alright, so now what I want to do is I want to read to you another section from the same section of the book on the Genii. I want to read to you something that I thought you guys might like, and that is another section that deals with this idea that they did stay and that they were never erased. Alright. So one of the things we noticed about the elves is that as we go further north, okay, there is, from European standpoint, as we go further north, we see more elves, okay? So as you go up into Sweden and all of those areas up there, right? As you get colder and colder and colder and colder, then the elves become more prominent. As we come back down into Europe, okay, Central Europe, and then over going west, and then going up into Ireland and Welsh, we see more fairies. This is historically speaking. This doesn't necessarily mean the day today, because today we both have elves and fairies, but and they've kind of been, blended into folklore, right? But this is very important. I'm going to read you this section. As we go further north, the belief in elves and the like increases and spreads. The Norwegians imagine them as little naked men with blue skins who take up their abode underneath the hills, trees, and houses. They sometimes attack a poor peasant and lead him miles out of his way, so far indeed that he never comes back again. Nevertheless, some of their victims have been seen again who, during their long absence, have lost their reason and cannot give any information about the mysterious creature who had led them astray. When an elf has taken possession of a tree or a house, woe betide anyone who would try to uproot or destroy it, to plant or build something else in its place. They have been seen, it is said, to carry for considerable distances churches whose neighborhood they felt to be unsuitable. Icelanders accuse them of sometimes stealing newborn children who have not yet been baptized and of putting one of their own in its place. But mothers and nurses take every precaution, and these accidents are very rare. This type of elemental inhabits rocks, hills, and often brooks, rivers, and the sea. It is said that their sisters and daughters who, in spite of their azure complexion, okay, that blueness, right, azul, are of an enchanting loveliness, sometimes preferred the inhabitants of earth to their subterranean lovers. Tales are told of Icelandic families who owe their origin to this mysterious kind of union. They are believed to have no soul, or at least no immortal soul. But as the children born of an elf and a man share the natures of both father and mother, they only have to be baptized by total immersion in holy water to obtain an immortal soul. Certain traditions speak of these marriages as examples of enduring affection, but it appears that however happy they may be at first, these unions always have a tragic end. Now, this is very interesting because baptism by immersion was something that the church did in the olden days. Christians, non-Catholic Christians, other Christians, still continue to baptize by immersion. But as you can see in this story, in this lore here, you can see that these elves, if born with, if these elves who procreate with a human, okay, that human has to be totally submerged. But then again, it continues to say that the outcome of an elf and human relationship is virtually always going to end in tragedy. Alright? Elves, next paragraph. Elves are invisible, and not only, and only very rarely reveal themselves to the eye of man. Nevertheless, they can sometimes be seen gambling in rays of sunshine, enjoying the gentle heart which they lack in their subterranean dwellings. They also like to walk the earth, especially to gather at crossroads during the first night of the new year. Hence the reason why we're talking about this tonight. Okay? At this period, magicians, okay, that would be contemporary Druids, walk, or any of the old priests, because the old priests, the old religions were all considered magicians. They were considered magi. Alright? At this period, magicians walk abroad in the countryside, wait to see the genies go by, and pronouncing certain magic words, compel them to reveal the future. Icelanders advise their children and their servants never to do anything which might offend these invisible hosts, who might at any time visit their homes. Others, even more solicitous, open doors and windows, serve a meal of milk and fruit, and leave a lamp lit on the table all night in order to show their sympathy toward any elves who may happen to pass that way, demonstrating that they are inviting elves who would be guided toward the light and not toward the darkness. Not necessarily is the darkness or the light, okay, good or bad, though we do understand that the darkness, it could be better being in the light, right? We want to be in the light, many of us. You know, it's that whole enlightenment idea, right? But to still continue to invite them, you know, into their homes. Some do this every night throughout winter. Every night throughout winter, they would go ahead and extend every night either a leftover piece of cheese or a piece of fruit or some butter, right? And milk, or some form of dairy as a drink. In the Faroe Islands, the elves, who otherwise resemble those of Iceland, wear a gray costume and a black hat. Their invisible herds pasture with those of the inhabitants, but sometimes the shepherds glimpse the shadowy image of a heifer or a dog that does not belong to our world, and they consider this vision as a sign of protection afforded them by the elves. This brings the idea in of ancient aliens, where our ancestors, the Greys, if you will, right? And well, I'm not so compelled to believe in it at this time because I just haven't done enough studying on it. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's inconceivable, because I do believe that, you know, the ancient aliens are conceivable, especially as we see in the glyphs and whatnot, and the drawings and cave drawings and whatnot, right? So we see things flying in the sky, and they're definitely not birds, right? We know that they're these discs flying in the sky, right? We see that in archaeology. We don't know what that is, you know? We know that it's myth, and we know that it's been reported, because if it wasn't reported, it wouldn't be on the walls. All right? But particularly I find this fascinating because of the term gray and black hat. Could be interesting. But I'm using this as a way to fortify my argument that there are 4 types of elves that I need and I believe and hold to be true and do exist. In Sweden, these spirits are famed for their dancing and melodious singing. This was one of my favorite stories here. Often they gather in hollowed rocks, and when the air is clear and the night still, they sing in soft and plaintive voices. If ever a traveler in the darkness accidentally breaks into one of the circles formed by these singers, they disappear from sight, and his fate is in their hands. But they never abuse their power when they have not been deliberately offended, and at the very most, they will play some harmless but mischievous trick on the innocent traveler. In some cases, though, we know that they don't let them go. We know that they continue to hold that person in that circle for eternity. The island of Zealand, the island of Zealand possesses elves who are much more formidable. They are most mischievous and malicious spirits called sprites in the north. The peasants have a magic tune which they call the Elf King's Air. And you should look that up and do your own research on that. At which they are very careful never to play or sing, for scarcely have the first notes begun that all present, young or old men, women and children, and even inanimate objects, spring up and dance without being able to stop, unless the imprudent musician is able to play the air backwards without a single false note, or unless a chance stranger comes in and cuts the violin strings. When we hear these stories, let me just grab a drink real fast. Sláinte. When we hear these stories, right, what we end up thinking about is this idea, especially in lore, where we're almost given the impossible task, right? The impossible task of getting out of these situations. Yet there's always something simpler, right? We always find out, well, you need you need two eyes of newt and whatever. But then there's something always simpler. Well, you could always do this, right? But this is interesting because this is very manipulative, but fun in a way, because what happens is the listener, or the one that needs to do the job of either saving another from the elves, or the mischievous ones, or saving himself, right? When they hear, okay, well, look, before you do this, this is what you got to do. They hear the first thing, right? And they're like, well, you got to do this, this, and this, right? And it's like, you got to jump through, 8 dragons, and, you got to, be able to hold the fire of the dragon in the palm of your hand, and whatever the case is. Then what they'll say, then that's it. So the person goes out and tries to do this, and they're like, I can't do it. Then the person giving the advice would always say something like, well, you could always just, cut the strings of the violin. And I'm like, well, why didn't you say that in the first place? The idea was always, in most every situation, to go out on a quest. Sometimes referred to today as a pilgrimage. The Scots, now, okay, as you can see, we're moving west Europe. Now we're moving West Europe, okay? We're moving into northwestern Europe, right? Ireland, Scots, all that. The elves are particularly fond, okay, of tormenting horses. Often in the early morning, when one enters the stable, these animals often found exhausted and panting, with bloodshot eyes, bristling mane. Obviously, during the night, they have been ridden almost to death by the elves of the neighborhood. In the cellars, especially of rich people, bottles lie scattered, some empty, others filled with liquid, which is no longer wine. But the elves' chief passion is for hunting. One dark night, a young sailor was journeying home in the Isle of Man. Suddenly, he heard the sound of horses, hooves, voices, horns, barkings. Intrigued, he began to follow them in spite of himself. After running several leagues, he at last leaped from the top of a high rock into a bog hidden in the darkness, in which he perished. Leap from a high rock. In this case, we're talking about a crag, I should say. The supernatural luring, okay, to death is one of the commonest of themes in folktales everywhere in the West. The I think it is, I'm so sorry about this. Ajudan, or luring out fires, inhabit caves and principes. They have the habit of seizing passers-by and forcing them to choose between the voyage above the air or one on earth. If the wretch's choice is the former, he is wafted up into the clouds, whence he is allowed to fall without warning and dash himself to pieces. If he chooses the latter, he is at once dragged over stones, rocks, thorns, marshes, cliffs, and perishes no less horribly. Alright. So that completes the idea of the segment of just understanding elves from an historical perspective. Okay? Magic doesn't always have to be done. Magic needs to be learned so that you can perform your own magic and not necessarily go buy yourself a book on magic spells, because a lot of these things are just made up. And I'm not saying that the author, well, kind of I am, but I mean, I'm not saying that the author is negligent. I'm just saying that, you know, these spell books that you would go ahead and buy are in. I mean, I said this a number of times. I must have maybe I have more books on magic and the history of magic versus spell books, right? I have maybe 3 spell books. That's it. I have 3, and I don't even use them. I mean, I went into them a few times. I mean, just to look at them, but I mean, I would never use any of them. Because I think that really, I mean, unless you have a mentor to teach you magic, okay, I don't necessarily believe that these spells are significant enough to get you to break away or break free from, you know, the strength of elven magic. All right. So let's talk about a summary of Gylfi. Alright, this was the king of Sweden. Alright, I'm going to give you like 7 or 8 points on this. He goes by Genii. And he makes a trip to Asgard, as we were talking about earlier, a sort of quest, right? Sort of pilgrimage. He goes out to Asgard. That's his idea, and he wants to reach this palace, right? So he's tricked by the Asher, which are the Norse gods, right? Along the way. And then he wonders this. He says, if all the gods use magic to trick their believers for their will to be done as sort of a way to guide them, knowing their reaction to each trick, would they be guided in the right direction? Alright? So he's then tricked by the Asher. He's tricked multiple times, mainly by a goddess, the goddesses. He's tricked and tricked and tricked. And remember that sometimes the word trick, okay, can be interpreted as discipline, teaching, right? Trick or treat was, do you want to learn something or do you want to treat, right? So this king then goes ahead and tries to figure out, look, listen, I want to get to this place, and I really don't have time to be, stopped every so often and be tricked. But little does he understand, these tricks that he's actually receiving are actually guiding him closer and closer to his quest, to the goal, to the treasure, to the point of, the point of which at one point he would return. 6th point. The king introduces himself as Gylfi when he arrives at the palace flooded with subjects. So he gets this palace, there's a whole bunch of people there, there's, whatever. But he's challenged to test, in point 7, he's challenged to test his knowledge and begins asking questions to demonstrate his knowledge. Alright? Now, this is very, very common in sagas. To demonstrate knowledge isn't necessarily to state facts, to state everything you know. To demonstrate knowledge is to ask questions. Your knowledge of those questions clearly signify the amount of knowledge you have. Because if you didn't have knowledge, you wouldn't be able to ask those questions. You only ask questions when you have certain knowledge as a prerequisite. That's what leads to questioning. You don't start a class and the first thing that you do is ask a question. If there's nothing that has been taught, there's no need to question if you're not learning, right? You have to be learning to ask more questions, and the more learning you are, the more knowledge you have, and then therefore the more you want to know. And that what you want to know are those questions. So in the last point that I wrote, he asks 3 questions. Alright? And there's 3 beings he addresses. One is called One to the High. Okay? The second is called Justice High. The third is called a Third. To the first, he asks a question regarding Norse mythology and the gods. To the second, he says, I want, more information about the creation myths, or the creation myth, specifically and mainly fire and ice. The third is the idea of destruction and the end of the world. The idea which would be in Christianity or Catholic, especially Catholic Christianity, would be Christianity, I guess, and most Bibles would be the Book of Revelation. But in this case, we're talking Ragnarok, right? The end of times. And a lot of people would say, well, where are we right now? And a lot of those who are who are members of the Gylfaginning today, not necessarily Druids, but the Gylfaginning would say that we are in Ragnarok right now. Like, this is Ragnarok. This is what Ragnarok is. It's this idea of complete and utter chaos. And that it's only when complete and utter chaos can take over that cosmos could start coming back into play. So those are the questions he asks. Now, I do have a 9th point, but it isn't really necessarily related. The 9th is this. In the end, he finds himself... Well, I'll just say it. In the end, he finds himself in a place where no one's around him. He's out of the palace, and he's basically transported to a place of his homeland, where he then goes and reports every single thing during his quest. And he reports that to the people. And then the people then start writing it down, and then that's how the saga is born. Alright. So why this story? The point of this story is that within this story, there are two elves that I want you to focus on. But then, later, in Grimm's Trinity, there's a third elf. And then there's a quadrinity of a fourth elf. Later, much later. Now, some people would say that these four elves are not four elves. These four elves are two elves. I couldn't disagree more with that. And to prove it, you can go back and listen to Dr. Jackson Crawford's talks. Jackson Crawford is a linguist. He knows language. And he would even, I think, agree with the fact that these four elves are different. They might be similar, 2 and 2, but they are different. All right. And we're going to talk about that story next. So let's read it. This is chapter 17 of the book Gylfaginning. And it begins like this. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. It's Gylfaginning. Sorry about that. Gylfaginning. Learning this stuff is not easy. All right. Gylfaginning. Then said Gungleri, Thou knowest many tidings to tell of heaven, which chief abodes are there more than at Uder's well. Now remember, Uttar Brunner is one of the three Norns. This is the past perfect fate, or that which has happened. Har, the person he's addressing, comes back and says this. Many places are there and glorious. That which is called Alfheimer, or Elfhome. For one, where dwell the peoples called the Light Elves. But the Dark Elves dwell down in the earth, and they are unlike in appearance, but by far more unlike in nature. The Light Elves, Ljósálfar, and if you listen to that word, Ljósálfar, what do you hear? You hear the word Lucifer. Ljósálfar. You hear that word, sorry about that. You hear that word, Ljósálfar, Lucifer, in a way that's light. Remember that Lucifer was light before he became darkness. The story. The Light Elves, Ljósálfar, are fairer to look upon than the sun, but the Dark Elves, Dökkálfar, okay, are blacker than pitch. Blacker than pitch. How can you become blacker than pitch? It's almost like next to impossible, right? That's how dark these elves are. And then quite the opposite would be the Ljósálfar. Okay, are blacker than pitch. Then there's also that place, okay, called Breidablik, which means broad gleaming. And there is not in heaven a fairer dwelling. Now it starts talking about heavens. If you notice, there are segments of the Bible that talk about the heavens. Listen to this. There too is the one called Glitner, or glittering, whose walls and all its posts and pillars are of red gold, but its root of silver. There is also the abode called Himinbjörk, or Heaven Craig. This is the tip of heaven. It stands at heaven's end by the bridgehead in the place where Bitfrost joins heaven. How many times do we hear of hell and heaven? Hell not being a place of fire, being a place of ice. How many times do we hear that? Another great abode is there, which is named Va Ala Sikir, the seat or shelf of the fallen. Skyaf. Valhalla Skyaf. Okay, the seat or shelf of the fallen. Odin possesses that dwelling. The gods made it and thatched it with sheer silver, and in this hall is the Hilid Skyaf, or gate seat, the high seat, so called. Whenever Allfather, Odin, sits in that seat, he surveys all the lands. Okay? And the southern end of heaven is that hall, which the fairest of all, and brighter than the sun, is called Dimle, heaven itself, or gem-decked. That means decked with gems. A place where the worthy survivors of Ragnarok are foretold to live. It shall stand when both heaven and earth have departed, and good men and of the righteous conversation shall dwell therein. So it is said in Voluspa, which is in Voluspa, the story of creation. A hall I know, standing, then the sun fair, thatched with gold, in Gimle bright. There shall dwell the doers of righteousness, and ever enjoy delight. Then said Gangleri, which shall guard this place when the flame of Sutra shall consume heaven and earth? Har then answers Gangleri and says this: It is sad that another heaven is to the southward and upward of this one, and it is called Atlungar, wide-reaching or extensive. But the third heaven is yet above that, and it is called Vidalblon, which is wide blue. And in that heaven we think this abode is. But we believe that none but Light Elves inhabit these mansions now. Notice the term mansions being used, and also mansions being used by Jesus of Nazareth while he was on the cross, saying there are many mansions, or maybe he wasn't in the cross, maybe it was some other time, but I mean, there are many mansions, and he mentions that. So, the elves in their correspondences. So, when you're talking about the Ljósálfar and Dökkálfar, okay, when you're talking about that, there's another two, if you will, types of elves that are brought up. The Myrkálfar, and the Svartálfar, the swarthy and the murky, all right? Sometimes it is said the Ljósálfar, right, and the Myrkálfar, okay, the murky and the light beings, right, that they're one, and the Dökkálfar and the Svartálfar are the same. But we know this is not true because Grimm points this out in the Brothers Grimm when he talks about this Trinity, saying that the Svartálfar are somewhere in between the Dökkálfar and the Ljósálfar. Alright? Though there is also a fourth, which is the Myrkálfar, which belong to the Ljósálfar. I say this, all four are different. And I say that all four have correspondences to different astronomical points in time. Just using the terms, the Ljósálfar, the light beings, the light elves, the bright, the midday. The midday, where the sun is at its highest point, that would be where the Ljósálfar dwell. The Myrkálfar would be disheveled. Now, if you're dirty, then the next step of being dirty, or dirtiest, would be to get clean, right? So that this would be the morning twilight. Getting ready to see the light, you know? Getting clean. The Dökkálfar are and dwell within midnight. They are black. Remember we talked about blacker than pitch? So they're not even black. They are, and not even pitch black. They're even darker than pitch black. Right? Imagine that. Imagine how dark that is. Right? And then this Svartálfar. Svartálfar. Sorry about that. The Swarthi. And they are twilight. Which twilight is this? This is the evening twilight, which is not the morning twilight. And so that twilight at the end is where they are then becoming to the point where they're moving into that next phase of elf, which is darker than pitch. I would say that if you were looking at times, then you would, at times you would know them midday, midnight, morning twilight, and evening twilight are 4 separate events, okay, that correspond with 4 separate elves, right? And then, in addition to that, you have 4 types, you have 4 parts of the year. The midday would celebrate summer. Midnight would celebrate winter. The morning twilight would represent what? It would represent the vernal equinox. And the evening twilight would represent the autumnal equinox. So that now you understand those 4 types of elves, okay, are these beings that then can not only work with those 4 times of the day, but also 4 parts of the year. I think that tonight's talk, the point was to discuss and help you understand elves. I truly, and I say this all the time when I talk to you guys, I'm like, you know, I believe in everything. I'm not an omnist, but I, in a sense where I believe in all religions or whatnot, or belief systems, but in a sense where I believe in all of these metaphysicals. I really do. I literally believe that, and in addition, I also believe it figuratively as well. How can it, you know, how can you work with them? How can you figuratively work with these creatures? But I do believe that you must believe in everything literally, fundamentally, and also figuratively. Because then you have an extreme vantage point where you actually physically, where you genuinely believe in elves, but then also figuratively understand their meaning, if you will. I don't think that you should be on the point of absolute belief and not enough meaning. I think that there should be some point where you come in between and say, you know what? Yeah, I believe they exist, but I also believe that this is what their meaning is as well. So when we're talking about the four elves, the murky elves, right? The light elves, and then you have the the darker than the darker than pitch itself, right? Those elves, the black elves, and then you have I guess I would say gray, if there was anything to really, kind of come by it. I don't know. Yeah, I don't. Swarthy was the word they used, but I mean, that whatever you want to use. But I don't necessarily believe that all of those elves are the same, and I don't necessarily believe that Grimm's idea of elves, is something that we should take as dogma, because he doesn't complete. He only adds one more, and that leads you to believe that there has to be an equivalent on the other side, because we know, for example, that the swarthy elves are definitely not in between both, that they are closer to one or the other. And that's it. That's tonight's talk. Thank you all very much for watching. I know that this was a very long presentation, but I thought that it needed to be had, this talk, because it's something that we as Druids today, not in the past, not with the most ancient Druids. I don't think they did, as we talked about earlier, but I think that we really need to understand that these beings are really real, and I hope one day to see one, so it'd be kind of cool. Anyway, so that should be about it. Hopefully that one would be benevolent. Maybe I might start finishing up my Yule with leaving out some food at night for the elves, to invite them and put a candle. Remember, you gotta put a candle there, to have it, make sure it's being drawn to the light. That's about it. So let's do your blessing. Alrighty, here we go, guys. May the gods bless you. May the goddesses keep you. May the metaphysicals shine their light upon you, and may your ancestors remain with you forever and ever. World without end. Girawan. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Again, I am come to you as Druid Naklas Clan, and a member of OCAB, or the Druid Order of Blessed Stone and Wood. It was a pleasure doing this tonight. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And remember, listen to this stuff in parts. You can't listen to this all at once. There's too much information there. Alright, whatever time of day it is, make it great. Girawan, Arnit, Betchigora, East, Lemogui, Tashe Fear.